What if the beginning of civilization is not where we think it is? What if the story of humanity, as it has been told, begins not in Sumer, but in the shadow of something far older, something deliberately forgotten? The clay tablets we admire in museums whisper of kings who reigned for thousands of years, of ages when the sky was closer and the gods walked among men. Yet the official record insists that civilization began around 5,000 years ago. Between these two versions of time lies a silence, a gap so wide that no textbook dares to bridge it. So, before you feel too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it there in your night? The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents ever unearthed. Etched into ancient clay, it catalogues the rulers of Mesopotamia, not as ordinary men, but as beings of impossible longevity. After the kingship descended from heaven, the tablet begins. The kings ruled for 241,200 years. 8 kings, each said to have reigned for thousands upon thousands of years, ruled before a great flood swept the earth clean. To the scholars who unearthed it, the text read like mythology. To others, it felt like memory, the echo of something too vast to fit within accepted timelines. Archaeologists found several versions of this list, from Sumer to Babylon, each repeating the same strange numbers. The city of Eridu, they said, was the first to hold kingship, the first city in the world. Its ruler, Alulim, reigned for 20th to them 800 years. His successor, Al-Olgar, for 36,000. Then came the flood. The pattern was too consistent, too structured to be dismissed as simple myth-making. And yet, what else could it be? The soil of Mesopotamia still bears traces of a flood layer, thick with river silt, suggesting that a deluge indeed struck this land around 10,000 years before written history. That same layer appears in sites across the Near East. But how could such an event predate civilization itself, unless civilization existed before the flood? Modern history marks its beginning with Sumer around 3200 BCE, when writing and organized city-states first emerged. But the king list speaks of a kingdom that existed before the deluge, ruled by beings whose reigns defy biology. It does not describe them as gods, not entirely, but as kings who descended from heaven. The phrasing is careful. It implies arrival, not creation, descent, not birth. When the tablets were first translated, most dismissed them as legend. But the numbers are not random. They follow a base 60 system, the same mathematical foundation that Sumerians used for time and astronomy. A 36,000-year reign might represent celestial cycles, encoded into narrative form. The same cycle appears in Vedic texts, Egyptian calendars, and even Mayan long-count systems, each describing epochs of rise and fall, as if the ancients were all remembering fragments of the same event. The question, then, is not whether these stories are literal, but what they are preserving. Could they be records of dynasties that ruled before the last great cataclysm, before the Younger Dryas, when sea levels rose 100 meters and glaciers collapsed across continents? Around 12,800 years ago, something struck the Earth. A comet, or perhaps fragments of one, ignited global fires and ended an age. The event is carved in ice cores, scattered across geology, and reflected in myths from nearly every culture. To the modern mind, this was prehistory. To the people who survived it, it was apocalypse. If the Sumerian king list remembers an age before that flood, it means human civilization, or something like it, existed before the earth was struck. It means knowledge, architecture, and lore may not have begun in Sumer but survived there. The kings who descended from heaven might not be gods at all, but survivors, the bearers of memory from a world that burned. Eridu, the city said to be first among all, lies buried beneath layers of sediment that predate its supposed founding. Beneath its ruins, archaeologists have found traces of older temples, older foundations. Each layer of construction sits upon another, reaching deeper into an unknown past. It is as if the first city was built upon the memory of an earlier one, a mirror image of something drowned. And what of the kings themselves? Could they represent dynasties stretching across millennia, with reigns later misinterpreted as single lifetimes? Or could the exaggeration mask something else? A deliberate coding of astronomical time, where one reign might mark a full precessional cycle of the Earth's wobble? The ancients did not measure years as we do. They saw time as a circle, not a line. Their gods did not die. They simply returned when the stars aligned again. There are ruins on every continent that seem to remember the same architecture. Megalithic stones fitted without mortar. Astronomical alignments tracking solstices. Myths of gods who came from the sky to teach humanity agriculture, mathematics, and law. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, those who came from above. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, the Greeks of the Titans. The names differ, but the structure remains, a race of beings who ruled, taught, and then vanished. Perhaps the king list was never meant as a literal record, but as a mnemonic, a way of preserving memory through symbol. In a world shattered by cataclysm, how does one remember what was lost? Maybe by writing it in myth, by turning history into story, by placing the gods in the heavens so their memory cannot drown. And yet, the precision of the numbers lingers. The repetition across texts defies coincidence. There is a strange logic beneath the poetry, one that suggests the Sumerians inherited their own past from someone else, someone who had seen the flood come before. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind moves across the desert ruins, the sand still uncovers fragments of those tablets, the same words, the same impossible years. They're not calling for belief, only for remembrance. If the first kings were not human, who were they? If civilization did not begin in Sumer, where did it begin? And if there was a last Anunnaki king buried somewhere beneath the dust of Eridu, how much of our history did he take with him into the dark? When the archaeologists first brushed away the sand in Nippur, they were not searching for gods. They were searching for accounting records, fragments of a civilization whose bureaucracy had long since turned to dust. Yet among those fragments, they found something no bureaucrat could have written, a list of kings whose reigns spanned epochs. The tablet was cracked but legible, its cuneiform pressed deep and deliberate. It did not read like poetry, it read like a record. The Nippur tablet was followed by others, found in Lhasa, Kish, and Uruk. Each bore nearly the same sequence of names, the same impossible durations, the same phrase repeated as though it were an oath. After the kingship descended from heaven. Across centuries, across dynasties, the words did not change. Scholars compared them and found only small variations, as if the scribes who copied them dared not alter their meaning. There was reverence in the precision, and fear in the silence between lines. To those who handle the tablets in museum archives, it must have felt like holding a contradiction. History told them that writing itself had barely been invented when these words were carved, and yet the tablet spoke of a deep past, of rulers and events that predated the invention of the very tool that recorded them. The king list, as it came to be known, was not a single document but a tradition. Each new city that rose after the flood copied it, amended it, tried to trace its own rulers back to those who came before the deluge. It was not myth, it was lineage. Among the oldest copies, the name Eridu appears first, a city now buried beneath layers of silt and salt. Archaeologists uncovered foundations there that seemed older than they should be. Remnants of temples layered one atop another like pages of a forgotten chronicle. The deepest of these layers, a simple shrine to Enki, lies in strata dating thousands of years before the known founding of Sumer. Some believe the builders of that first structure remembered something older still, a place, a time, or a people erased by water. When the tablets mention the descent of kingship, they speak of an arrival, not an origin. In Sumerian, the phrase Nam Lugal, Hanta Ed Di, carries a subtle implication. not that kingship was created on earth, but that it was bestowed. The kings came from elsewhere, bringing order, law, and the right to rule. That right the Sumerians believed was not human in nature, it came from the heavens. This phrase finds strange echoes in other myths. In Egypt, the first kings were said to have ruled in the time of the gods, beings called the Shem-Tu-Hor, the followers of Horus who governed before the pharaohs. In India, ancient Vedic texts speak of Manu, the first lawgiver who survived a flood and restored the world. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha are remembered as white-robed beings who emerge from the sea to teach the survivors of a cataclysm. These are not isolated coincidences. They are fragments of a shared trauma, scattered across time and culture, memories of a reset so absolute that it fractured human history. In 1899, the German archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht announced his discovery of the kingless tablets from Nipah. He noted, almost with disbelief, that the chronology began before any recorded dynasty, in a time before the flood. The academic world received his findings politely, but uneasily. Some suggested the numbers represented lunar months, not solar years. Others claimed they were symbolic of divine perfection. Yet even after conversion, the figures refused to shrink into reason. Even reduced, they still spanned tens of thousands of years, an age that history does not allow. Why then did these scribes, pragmatic in all other records, preserve such exaggeration? Why inscribe nonsense with such care? Perhaps the answer lies not in their mathematics but in their memory. When survivors of cataclysm rebuild, they do not begin with dates. They begin with stories. They build their new world upon what little they remember of the old. And memory, passed through generations, stretches and distorts, but never dies. There is a haunting idea among comparative mythologists that the king list was not a chronology, but a code. Each reign may represent a celestial period, each king a phase of precession, each succession a shift in the sky. In that reading, the descent of kingship from heaven could describe the alignment of stars, the moment when a particular constellation presided over the earth. If so, the tablets are not history, they are astronomy, written in human metaphor. But others suspect something more tangible, that these lists preserve the names of actual beings, leaders of a lost world remembered as divine because their knowledge exceeded that of the new humanity, rising from mud and ash. The Anunnaki, those who came from above, were described not as spirits but as flesh and blood entities who built temples, issued decrees, and mingled with mortals. The Sumerians depicted them with wings, but perhaps those wings were never meant to be literal. Perhaps they were symbols of descent, the mark of those who arrive from the sky. Over time, as the old world faded, myth replaced memory. The Anunnaki became gods, and their kings became legends. Yet beneath the religious language, one can still trace a practical reality. A knowledge system so advanced that later generations mistook it for divinity. The flood erased not just cities, but continuity. Those who survived must have struggled to translate the fragments of a lost science into a language that no longer understood it. To preserve what they could, they carved it into clay, wrapped it in metaphor, and called it sacred. In 2016, satellite imagery of southern Iraq revealed patterns of buried walls and canals beneath Eridu's ruins, suggesting an organized city plan far older than its known occupation. Geologists studying the soil found marine sediments mixed with freshwater silt, signs of a great inundation, but also of rebuilding. It seems that Eridu rose not once but many times, like a city haunted by its own reflection. If the king list preserves this continuity, the parsing of knowledge from one epoch to the next, then the kings who descended from heaven were not gods at all, but messengers of survival. Each carried a fragment of a story too vast to fit into a single lifetime. They built, taught, and then vanished, leaving behind a civilization that would one day forget them. The tablets themselves remain silent now, kept in glass cases where few eyes linger. Their wedge-shaped marks are faint, yet enduring, symbols of a language older than any alphabet carved by hands that still seem to tremble across the gulf of time. When you read them, you can almost hear the whisper of those who wrote. That kingship is a memory of descent, that heaven was once closer than it seems, and somewhere, perhaps beneath the ruins of Eridu, or buried beneath the Black Sea, lies the answer to a question no one dares to ask aloud. What if the first kings were not the beginning of civilization, but the last survivors of the one before? The story of Enki begins in water. In the oldest surviving Sumerian hymns, he is called Lord of the Abzu, the abyss beneath the earth, the source of all fresh water and all wisdom. His temple at Eridu, the Iabsu, stood upon what was once a shoreline, long since reclaimed by the desert. Beneath it, archaeologists found layers of clay silt, traces of a flood that swept across the ancient city. To the Sumerians, this was not mere geology. It was the mark of a divine intervention. They believed that Enki had guided humanity through the waters of destruction, preserving the seeds of civilization for a new beginning. The myth of the Great Flood is older than writing itself. It appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in tablets found in Nineveh that predate even Abraham. A god warns a mortal of an impending deluge. A vessel is built. The world is washed clean. The pattern repeats across the planet in cultures that never met. In India's tale of Manu, in the story of Deucalion in Greece, in the Popol Vuh of the Maya, each tells of a reset, a moment when gods and men were separated by water. If Enki was the one who saved humanity, what did he save them from? The geological record points to something more tangible than divine punishment. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was struck by a violent shift. Ice cores from Greenland show a sudden spike in platinum and soot, indicators of global fire. Ocean levels rose abruptly. The Younger Dryas, a millennium-long plunge back into glacial cold, began almost overnight. For centuries afterward, the world burned, flooded, froze, and then began again. In that narrow corridor of survival, the myths say Enki instructed his chosen man, Ziusudra, to build an ark and preserve the knowledge of the antediluvian world. It was not just life that was being saved, it was memory. Some scholars, looking beyond theology, see in this story the shadow of a real disaster. They suggest that a comet or fragments of one struck the ice sheets of North America, melting glaciers and triggering worldwide floods. Ancient humanity, already organized along river deltas, would have watched the oceans rise hundreds of feet, swallowing their world. If so, then the myth of Enki is not fiction. It is testimony, a record disguised as reverence. In its lines, we can hear the faint voice of an earlier civilization, one advanced enough to chart the stars, build monumental architecture, and measure time through celestial patterns. A world that understood mathematics before the Sumerians rediscovered it. Archaeologists at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey have unearthed stone enclosures that predate Sumer by over 6,000 years. The pillars there bear animal carvings arranged in patterns that may record a catastrophic event in the sky, a shower of meteors perhaps, or a comet's passage. The builders covered their sanctuary deliberately, as if to preserve it for the future. Their descendants would later populate Mesopotamia. The line between Göbekli Tepe and Eridu is faint but direct. The flood did not erase humanity. It merely washed away the continuity of its memory. When Enki whispered to Ziusudra, he was not speaking only of survival. He was speaking of preservation. The legend says that after the waters receded, Enki instructed the survivors to rebuild according to the old ways, to measure, to mark, to remember. The Sumerians believed their writing came from him, the first language gifted to men. But perhaps that gift was something rediscovered, a system of symbols passed down from those who lived before the flood. Some researchers have compared the geometry of ancient Sumerian temples with those of pre-flood structures like Göbekli Tepe, noting recurring ratios and alignments. Both seem to encode astronomical relationships, especially the solstices and the position of Sirius. If such knowledge truly spanned epochs, then Enki's divine wisdom might have been scientific inheritance, the remnants of a lost system of measurement, saved by memory and myth. In the text of the Enuma Elish, Enki is a complex figure, neither purely benevolent nor entirely human. He defies the higher gods to protect humankind, teaching forbidden knowledge to those below. This duality echoes later myths of Prometheus, of Lucifer, of Hermes Trismegistus, the bringers of light who defied heaven to aid mankind. To call them fallen may simply reflect the fear of those who came after. Fear of knowledge unrestrained. There is a quiet pattern here. Every age begins with a teacher, and every teacher becomes a god. But gods too fall silent when their temples turn to dust. Enki's temples are buried beneath millennia of salt, yet their orientation still points toward the southern sky. Some astronomers suggest that his sacred direction aligns with the star Canopus, visible only from low latitudes during certain epochs. Could this alignment have once marked the position of a lost homeland farther south? Perhaps a memory of pre-flood lands now beneath the Persian Gulf. Geological surveys of that Gulf basin reveal the outlines of an ancient river system, dry for 10,000 years. Once it flowed between the Tigris and the Indus, feeding a lush plain now drowned beneath the sea. Satellite imaging shows traces of settlements along those submerged channels. Some call it the garden beneath the Gulf. If that was the cradle of the earliest humans, then the flood described by Enki's myth was not metaphor. It was a drowning of the world's first cities. When the survivors fled northward, they carried fragments of a lost culture, language, mathematics, sacred measures. From these fragments, Sumer would rise. The tablets speak of the flood as an event dividing time itself, before and after. In that division lies the root of all kingship, all hierarchy, all myth. For the Sumerians, Enki's act of preservation justified their rule. They were the descendants of those chosen to rebuild. And so, every temple built in Sumer was a recreation of the Abzu, the watery abyss. Every ziggurat was a mountain against the next flood. The architecture of salvation became the architecture of power. Yet in each stone there lingers a memory, not of punishment, but of loss. The kind of loss that reshapes humanity's understanding of itself. If Enki was real, perhaps he was not a god at all. Perhaps he was one of those ancient survivors, a bearer of knowledge from a world that drowned. His divine act of saving humanity might simply have been the preservation of science, passed down through myth so it would survive the ignorance of the ages to come. The flood was not only an end, it was a veil. Beneath that veil, the story of civilization was rewritten, and what came before was consigned to legend. But somewhere beneath the shifting sands of Eridu, beneath layers of salt and silt, may still rest the remnants of that earlier world. Tablets sealed in bitumen, inscriptions in a language we can no longer read. What secrets might those buried words hold? What memories might rise again if the Abzu were ever uncovered? There is a peculiar calm in the geological record just before disaster. A layer of pollen, thick with warmth-loving plants, then suddenly, ash, soot, and silence. The Younger Dryas began with fire and ended with ice. Around 10,800 BCE, something struck the planet, or the planet struck something. The evidence lies in every continent. A thin black mat rich in nanodiamonds, melt glass, and platinum. The unmistakable fingerprint of cosmic impact. To the ancients, it was not science. It was the anger of the heavens. To us, it is still a mystery. The earth reset itself, and with it, the story of humanity. The myths that survived the flames speak in one voice. Across the world, people remembered a time before, a golden age, when knowledge was pure and the gods walked openly among men. Then came the flood, A fire, the long winter. Plato wrote of Atlantis swallowed by the sea in a single night. The Egyptians remembered Zep Tepi the first time, when divine beings raised their civilization from the mud after catastrophe. The Hopi spoke of the end of previous worlds, destroyed when men forgot the sacred laws. Every story ends the same way, with the fall of those who knew too much. Science calls it the Younger Dryas boundary. The ancients called it divine judgment. Around that same period, ocean levels rose by more than 100 meters. The meltwater from collapsing ice sheets drowned entire coastlines. In the Persian Gulf Basin, now a drowned desert, rivers once flowed through fertile plains. In Southeast Asia, land bridges vanished beneath the waves. In the Americas, mammoths and saber-toothed cats disappeared in a geological heartbeat. The event was not local, it was global. What does it mean to live through the end of a world? Archaeological strata suggest that human populations plummeted. Entire technologies vanished. But within a few thousand years, monumental architecture began to appear. Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, Çatalhöyük. It was as if those who survived had returned to rebuild, carrying fragments of knowledge from before. The Sumerians would later describe this moment as the return of kingship, the moment when order descended again from the heavens. Some geologists argue that a fragmented comet broke apart in Earth's atmosphere, scattering molten debris across the ice sheets. The heat alone could have vaporized kilometers of ice, sending torrents of water rushing across continents. The Black Sea, once a freshwater lake, flooded catastrophically when the Mediterranean breached its walls. A deluge of salt water rolled through the Bosporus, submerging valleys and settlements in hours. This event, now called the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, may have been the very flood remembered in Sumerian and biblical text. But it is the cultural memory that haunts. Why do myths from South America to Mesopotamia describe the Shining Ones? Tall, radiant figures who arrived after the cataclysm to restore knowledge. In Peru, they were the Viracochas. In Sumer, the Anunnaki. In Egypt, the Neteru. Always descending from the sky, always rebuilding. Were they metaphors for celestial bodies, or echoes of real survivors who carried the memory of a world that no longer existed? Imagine the shock of those early humans watching their horizon dissolve. Mountains turning to islands, the stars shifting in the sky, whole landscapes erased in days. In that trauma, something was born. The need to remember, the need to pass down warnings disguised as worship. The gods became personifications of cosmic cycles, forces that destroy and renew. The myths became coded messages, reminders that what has happened once can happen again. For thousands of years after the flood, the climate stabilized and humanity began anew. Agriculture emerged simultaneously in multiple regions, as though memory itself had been reawakened. Grain cultivation in Mesopotamia, rice in East Asia, maize in Mesoamerica, each appearing without a clear point of origin. It was not invention, it was recollection. The knowledge of how to sustain life had simply been waiting beneath the surface, like seeds buried in mud. And yet, something else was buried with it, an unspoken awareness that this peace was temporary. The Sumerians built their ziggurats as mountains of refuge, stairways between earth and heaven. The Egyptians carved their pyramids as tombs of resurrection. Across cultures, sacred architecture pointed skyward, as if trying to reach the realm that had once descended. Every brick was an act of remembrance, every ritual a reenactment of survival. In the depths of Eridu, the Fur City, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of repeated rebuilding, layers upon layers, each destroyed and restored. Some structures seem deliberately buried, much like Göbekli Tepe. Why? To protect something from destruction, or to preserve it for those who would come after. Beneath one such layer lies a small altar carved with strange marks, spirals, waves, and what appear to be constellations. The symbols correspond roughly to celestial events known to have occurred around the time of the Younger Dryas. Could these be the earliest records of the disaster itself? If the flood was a global reset, then perhaps the Anunnaki myths remember those who kept the flame alive through darkness. Survivors, not deities, the lost bearers of antediluvian knowledge. Their descent from heaven might describe their arrival from surviving highlands, or even from other continents. Over time, distance and reverence transformed them into gods. What they rebuilt became civilization. What they remembered became religion. But history as it survives is a mosaic of what was not destroyed. Every time a flood recedes, it takes more than soil with it. It takes language, mathematics, lineage. The gaps between our oldest texts are not mere voids of ignorance. They're wounds. When the lost survivors wrote of kings who ruled for thousands of years, perhaps they were not exaggerating. Perhaps they were marking epochs of time, each ruled by a single lineage of knowledge. The length of their reigns measured not in lifetimes but in cycles of the earth itself. In that sense, the Younger Dryas was not just a geological event. It was the first reset, the rewriting of time. What came before became myth. What remained became history. Between them lies a silence we still cannot fill. Tonight, as satellites orbit above and ice melts again at the poles, we live on the edge of another change. The same patterns return: fire, flood, forgetting. The ancients might whisper that the cycle is not broken, only paused, that every age ends as the last one did. Suddenly, mercilessly, beautifully. If civilization has been born and erased before, then how many times has the story begun again? How many worlds have we already forgotten? And when the next reset comes, who will be left to remember us? In the south of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates once kissed the sea, there stood a city called Eridu. Its ruins today are unremarkable, crumbling mounds of mud brick and fractured pottery. But beneath them lies something extraordinary. 17 layers of human construction, one atop another, spanning thousands of years. At the very bottom, archaeologists found a temple, simple and rectangular, built of clay. It was the first of its kind. They called it the House of Enki, the god of wisdom, lord of the abyss. The Sumerians called it Abzu. The oldest city in the world had been built not for men but for a god. Yet when the first excavators uncovered Eridu, they noticed something strange. Each temple was rebuilt in the same exact place, again and again, as if its location held sacred geometry. The orientation was not random. It aligned precisely with certain stars over the southern horizon, long vanished from modern skies. The deeper they dug, the older the structures became, and the more primitive. But at the lowest level, the foundation was unusually refined, its bricks uniform and hardened, unlike anything expected from its supposed era. It was as though the earliest builders had possessed the most advanced skill, and over time, that mastery had faded. The myth tells us that Eridu was the first city after the flood. Kingship descended from heaven, the kingless says, and Eridu became the seat of kingship. The first ruler, Alolim, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. Scholars have dismissed these numbers as symbolic, yet the site itself whispers otherwise. The ziggurat that once rose above the city seems to have been modeled on something older still. A memory of a mountain, perhaps, or a great platform that once stood before the floodwaters came. Some researchers believe Eridu's design encodes astronomical knowledge. Its earliest levels seem aligned to the rising of Canopus, a bright southern star visible only from low latitudes around 11,000 BCE, the time when sea level was far lower, and the coastline extended hundreds of kilometers farther south. If true, this would mean that the first foundation of Eridu predates conventional history by millennia. Beneath the sand, it may have begun as a port for a vanished shore, the last remnant of a drowned world. The Sumerians credited Enki, the god of wisdom, with teaching humanity how to build, to irrigate, to write, and to measure. His temple at Eridu was not merely a shrine, it was the blueprint for civilization. The myth of Enki's Abzu describes an underground chamber of pure water, where all knowledge originates, the deep memory of the earth. When priests descended into the temple's lower levels, they believed they were entering that sacred abyss. Archaeologists found stairways leading down into waterlogged chambers that matched this description exactly. Beneath the foundation lies a natural aquifer, a literal underworld of water. To the ancients, it was no metaphor. But who was Enki, really? To the Sumerians, he was a god who walked among them. To modern eyes, he might represent something older, a teacher from the pre-flood world, remembered as divine by those who survived. The tablets speak of his boat of heaven, a vehicle that shimmered like the stars. His temple was said to glow with electrum, its walls reflecting light like gold. These are the words of poets, yet there is precision in them, a memory of something bright, mechanical, beyond explanation. The priests of Eridu practiced rituals of measurement. They timed the flooding of the rivers, charted the moon's path, and calculated the movements of Venus. It was from this city that the sexagesimal system, base 60, emerged, the same system we still use to divide time. How could such mathematical sophistication arise fully formed at the dawn of recorded history? Perhaps it did not arise at all. Perhaps it was preserved. The site's repeated rebuilding might have served a deeper purpose. Each temple may have been a recalibration, a way of maintaining alignment with the shifting heavens. Over centuries, the stars moved due to precession. To keep the Abzu in harmony with the sky, the builders would have needed to rebuild at precise intervals. In that sense, Eridu was not a city at all, but an instrument, a clock of stone, tracking the slow heartbeat of the cosmos. Later myths tell that Enki defied the higher gods to save humanity from the flood, warning Ziusudra to build a vessel. The story echoes the later tale of Noah. But there is another, quieter story embedded within it, that Enki, or those he represented, carried something across the deluge, not animals, but knowledge. The foundation of Eridu, buried in silt, may have been the anchor for that knowledge, the first reconstruction after chaos. Beneath the dust, fragments of copper tools and glazed stones have been found, artifacts that do not belong to the supposed timeline. Some show signs of advanced metallurgy, though the city dates to the Neolithic. One fragment, unearthed in the 1940s, contained traces of tin bronze, an alloy not thought to exist until thousands of years later. The find was quietly archived, its anomaly never resolved. It is as if Eridu inherited techniques rather than invented them. If the first builders were following instructions, whose instructions were they? The Sumerians said that the Imi, divine decrees of civilization, were kept in Enki's temple. These were not moral laws, but blueprints for the arts, sciences, and institutions of the world. The texts describe them as tablets of destiny, physical objects that contain the pattern of creation. When the goddess Inanna later demanded them, she claimed they held the power to raise kingship from the dust. To us, it sounds like mythology. To them, it was history. Standing amid the ruins of Eridu today, one can feel an unease that defies the dryness of the desert. The air hums with stillness, as if the city remembers. The horizon ripples where land meets sky, and in that shimmering distance you can almost imagine the sea returning, the ancient gulf lapping once more at the foot of the ziggurat. Somewhere below, in the deeper layers still unexcavated, lies the original foundation, untouched, sealed by time. If it were uncovered, what might we find? A vault of knowledge, a relic of prehistory, or perhaps only silence, the kind that conceals as much as it reveals. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first place where heaven touched earth, and where memory began again. But if the builders were following the echoes of an older design, then Eridu was not the first city. It was a replica, a remembrance, and somewhere, buried deeper still, might lie the original, the true city of the gods, waiting beneath layers of forgotten time. What would happen if we found it? Would we recognize it as ours, or as something that never belonged to us at all? At night, the desert above Eridu seems endless, a sea of black sand where stars glimmer like grains of salt scattered across eternity. For the ancients, the sky was not empty space. It was a script. The gods did not speak in words but in alignments, in the shifting of constellations and the rhythm of celestial bodies. In this language, the Anunnaki were not just gods. They were astronomers, architects of time itself. Across Sumer, tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped symbols reveal an obsession with the heavens. The earliest cuneiform records are not hymns or lores, but star charts. They trek the risings of Venus, the retrograde loops of Jupiter, the eclipses of the moon. The priests of Enki, known as the Baru, believed that every movement in the sky mirrored a movement on earth. To them, astronomy and divinity were one. They mapped the stars not out of curiosity but obedience. Among these star tablets is a small fractured piece known as Enuma Arnu Enlil, dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE, but preserving far older knowledge. It describes celestial gods who appear, disappear, and return at fixed intervals. Heavenly beings with predictable cycles. One line speaks of a red star of kingship that returns after long absence, bringing upheaval to the world. To modern readers, it sounds like an omen. To ancient astronomers, it was a clockwork prophecy. Some researchers have suggested that this red star might represent a lost celestial body, a wandering planet, or perhaps a recurring comet that haunted early skies. In Sumerian myth, there is mention of Nibiru, the crossing point, described as a radiant body associated with the god Marduk. The word itself means place of crossing, and though often misinterpreted by modern writers, its symbolism remains striking. A celestial visitor that comes and goes, rewriting the heavens each time it passes. Could this myth preserve the memory of an actual astronomical event, a planet or stellar body whose orbit once brought it near the Earth? Ancient star maps from Mesopotamia, when compared to later Babylonian ones, show subtle discrepancies. Constellations slightly out of place, as if drawn from a sky tilted differently than our own. This may not be imagination. Geological evidence suggests that around 13,000 years ago, a pole shift altered the orientation of Earth's axis. The sky the first Sumerians saw was not quite the same sky we know today. If so, the sky scripts of the Anunnaki might not be pure mythology, but coded observations, records of a world in flux. The priests who gazed upward from their ziggurats may have been watching not for omens but for patterns, waiting for the return of something long foretold. The king list itself, with its immense spans of time, could correspond to these celestial cycles, epochs measured not by human lifetimes, but by the revolutions of heaven. In later Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki are described as those who decree the fates of stars. Their number varies, sometimes 7, sometimes 12, echoing the sacred count of planetary bodies visible to the naked eye. Each was associated with a celestial sphere, Enki with Mercury, Enlil with Jupiter, Inanna with Venus. The Sumerians understood that these wandering lights were not fixed, that they moved independently from the constellations. In this discovery lay the foundation of both astronomy and astrology, and perhaps something even older, a remnant of knowledge carried through the flood. The ziggurat of Eridu, and later the grand structure of Ur, were built as stairways to heaven, but they also served a scientific function. Their layered terraces allowed precise measurement of the stars' positions against the horizon. Each step represented a degree of the sky. When the priests ascended at night, they were not climbing toward gods, but into the domain of celestial calculation. From these high platforms they traced the movement of the ecliptic, marking the precession of equinoxes long before Greek astronomers formalized it. In one fragmentary tablet from Sipa, a priest records the time when the watchers came from the Abzu to measure the firmament. The description is cryptic yet evocative. They held in their hands the rods of measuring, and their garments shone like bronze. To modern eyes, it could simply describe priests with instruments of copper and gold. To the mythic imagination of later generations, they became gods descending from heaven. Over centuries, the instruments of knowledge transformed into symbols of divinity. The sky scripts were not limited to Sumer. In Egypt, the ceilings of tombs and temples bear the same alignments, the same celestial diagrams. In China, the earliest oracle bones record eclipses and comets with similar reverence. Across Mesoamerica, the Maya charted the heavens with uncanny precision, their calendars stretching into cycles of thousands of years. How did cultures separated by oceans and millennia share such a unified vision of the cosmos? Perhaps the memory of the flood was not the only inheritance that crossed the ages. If the Anunnaki were once astronomers, watchers of the heavens, their story might encode a warning as much as a memory. The recurrence of the crossing star, the return of celestial fire, the pattern of destruction and renewal all point to cyclical awareness. They did not see time as linear, but as repeating ages. Each age began with descent, the gods coming down, and ended with ascent, the return to the sky. Modern astrophysics speaks of periodic comet showers, debris fields that Earth passes through every few thousand years, remnants of ancient celestial collisions. Some of these cycles match roughly the intervals of devastation recorded in geological strata. Could it be that the Sumerians, through myth and measurement, were remembering the rhythm of these cosmic encounters? To them, the Anunnaki were not merely beings, but embodiments of these forces. Celestial cycles personified, their descents marking each reset of civilization. The tablets of Nineveh, discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal, confirm that later astronomers continued this sacred duty. They observed the skies, preserved data, and warned of omens. Yet by then, the original purpose had been lost. What began as knowledge became ritual, and what began as measurement became worship. The Anunnaki, once teachers of the stars, were transformed into figures of fear and reverence. Their scripts, the mathematical records of heaven, were reinterpreted as divine commandments. Today, we read those tablets with detached curiosity. We see numbers, symbols, coordinates, but not meaning. We no longer look up and feel the weight of fate written across the constellations. The sky has become decoration, not destiny. But perhaps the ancients were right to listen. As stars move slowly yet with precision, as if following a script written before our time. If there is truth in the idea of Nibiru, of cycles and returns, then the Anunnaki were not prophets but historians, witnesses to a recurring event that reshapes the world each time it comes. And if one day a red star appears again on the horizon, bright, slow, and familiar, would we recognize it for what it is? Or would we, like them, mistake the language of the sky for the voice of gods descending once more? Long before the first wedge of cuneiform pressed its mark into clay, there existed another language, one without sound, without alphabet, older than words themselves. It was the language of symbols. Across the plains of Mesopotamia and the valleys of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have found shards of pottery, tokens, and tablets etched with signs that predate Sumerian writing by thousands of years. These symbols were not random. They were deliberate, consistent, and hauntingly familiar. Circles, spirals, crosses, triangles, eyes, and serpentine lines repeat across cultures that never met. It is as if humanity once shared a forgotten grammar, one that survived in silence long after its speakers vanished. Among these relics are the Sturteria tablets of Romania, small clay plaques inscribed with pictograms resembling early cuneiform. Dated to around 5300 BCE, they precede the Sumerian script by more than a millennium. Some dismiss them as ritual objects, meaningless scrolls made by primitive tribes. Others see in them the ghost of a lost written system, a proto-script that once connected distant cultures before the flood. The symbols found on these tablets appear again in Vinca pottery, in the caves of the Balkans, and even in Neolithic Anatolia. It is as if fragments of one ancestral language were scattered across continents, preserved in clay like seeds awaiting rediscovery. The Sumerians said that writing was a divine gift from Enki, the god who gave words to men so that knowledge might endure. But what if writing was not born in Sumer at all? What if the Sumerians merely reawakened something that had been buried, something ancient and instinctive? In their myths, the Anunnaki are described as those who decree destiny. To decree destiny, one must record it. The ability to write, then, was not simply communication, it was control. Each symbol carved into clay was a spell of permanence, a defiance of chaos. And yet, if we trace the evolution of these symbols backward, we find that they lose complexity the further we go. The earliest ones are abstract, cosmic, almost mathematical, signs of cycles, elements, and forces. Over time, they become literal, human, domesticated. As civilization rises, language descends. In the temples of Eridu, priests used small clay tokens to represent commodities, grain, cattle, oil, long before they wrote names or prayers. But some tokens depict things that have no earthly use: stars, wings, eyes surrounded by rays. These are not trade items, they are ideas. Perhaps they are remnants of a system once used to encode astronomical or metaphysical knowledge. The Mi of Sumerian mythology, those sacred decrees of civilization, were said to contain the essence of creation: music, architecture, kingship, love, war, and writing. Each was represented as an object, a tabletable disk inscribed with divine marks. To receive the Mi was to inherit the wisdom of the gods. When Inanna stole them from Enki's temple, she was said to have unleashed knowledge upon humanity. But knowledge, once freed, could not be contained. Scholars have long debated the origin of the Sumerian script. It appears suddenly, fully formed, around 3200 BCE. There is no evidence of gradual development, no half-formed stages, no linguistic fumbling. It emerges as if remembered, not invented. The earliest tablets already show complex grammatical structure and abstract notation. How could such sophistication arise from nothing? It is as though the memory of writing returned, like a forgotten song. Linguists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as cultural re-emergence, when lost ideas surface again through intuition, as if imprinted in collective memory. Perhaps humanity carries within its mind the residue of an earlier intelligence, encoded not in genes but in symbols. Across the globe, the same forms appear: the spiral for time, the triangle for divinity, the circle for eternity. Even in modern symbols, the cross, the wheel, the serpent, echoes of that primordial language persist. Some researchers, like Maria Gimbutas, suggested that these early European signs represented a peaceful, goddess-centered civilization destroyed or assimilated by later patriarchal cultures. Others, such as Joseph Campbell, believe they reflected the remnants of an ancient mythic code, the universal lexicon through which humanity once communicated its understanding of the cosmos. But there is another possibility, that these signs were the literal inheritance of a pre-cataclysmic culture, preserved subconsciously by survivors and reinterpreted by their descendants. In Mesopotamian myth, the god Enki creates the first humans to maintain the earth and record its cycles. He teaches them language, mathematics, and the order of the stars. But in some older versions, the Anunnaki do not create humans, they awaken them. They placed upon the clay the sign of knowing, the text says. That phrase, the sign of knowing, might not refer to DNA or divine breath. It might mean language itself, the awakening of symbolic thought, the ability to name and thus to remember. When the flood came, the signs were scattered. The survivors carried them in art, in pottery, in the memory of ritual. When they rebuilt, they began again with symbols, and from symbols came words. Each civilization that rose after the cataclysm reinterpreted the fragments in his own way. But the core remained the same. The serpent, the eye, the mountain, the star. Each a syllable in a forgotten sentence. Even today, the oldest symbols still haunt us. We draw them without thinking, spirals on notebooks, triangles in designs, circles divided by lines. They appear in dreams, in architecture, in sacred geometry. Psychologists call them archetypes, but perhaps they are not psychological at all. Perhaps they are archaeological, relics of a language older than speech, embedded in the collective human mind. The deeper one studies ancient writing, the more it resembles music, a rhythm of shapes, a silent resonance. Each mark carries not just meaning, but vibration, an echo of the human breath that first imagined it. To the priests of Sumer, writing was alive. Each stroke invoked power, each word anchored spirit. The act of inscription itself was ritual, a bonding between heaven and earth. The clay was the body, the sign, the soul. And so, as modern scholars translate the cuneiforms with the cold precision of computers, something essential is lost. We read them as data, but they were meant to be felt, spoken softly, sung perhaps, in the hush of a temple at dusk. Through those murmured syllables, the ancients believed they could summon memory itself. Somewhere in that forgotten music lies the first story, the one that birthed all others. A language that began not in sound, but in symbol. A tongue of gods and stars buried beneath millennia of dust. If the Anunnaki truly existed, perhaps they left no monuments, no bones, only this, a code of shapes, a grammar of eternity still flickering in our dreams. What if the last key to understanding them has been before us all along, written not on tablets or stones, but in the patterns our hands still draw when they are left alone? The ancients believed that blood carried memory, not metaphorically, literally. They saw lineage as a vessel through which divine essence passed, unbroken and alive. In Sumerian myths, the Anunnaki did not simply create humankind, they mingled with it. The Epic of Atrahasis speaks of clay mixed with the blood of a god to form the first man. It is a poetic image, but perhaps it conceals something else, a coded memory of biological intervention, or at least the belief that humanity's origin was touched by something not entirely of this world. The priests of Eridu described kingship as inheritance from heaven, a gift bound by bloodline. The first kings were said to be direct descendants of the gods, their veins shimmering with what the tablets called the bright essence. This divine substance, symbolized by gold and sunlight, separated rulers from common men. The right to rule, they said, was not political, it was genetic. This idea spread like fire across civilizations. The Egyptian pharaohs declared themselves sons of Ra, born of the solar blood. The Hebrew texts speak of Nephilim, the offspring of divine beings and mortal women, giants of renown who once walked the earth. The Book of Enoch, long banned from canonical scripture, describes them as hybrid beings, neither fully divine nor human, teaching forbidden arts to mankind before being cast down. In the Sumerian world, they were the mighty ones, the heroes who built cities and ruled for thousands of years before the flood. Could these myths all refer to the same event, a convergence of bloodlines, a moment when something extraordinary entered the human genome? Modern geneticists have identified sudden and unexplained leaps in human development, from cranial expansion to language ability. The Great Leap Forward, that mysterious period when symbolic thought, art, and culture emerged almost overnight, remains an evolutionary puzzle. It is as if intelligence was not a slow bloom, but a spark. The Sumerians attributed that spark to the Anunnaki. In one fragment, Enki instructs the creation of humankind to bear the load of the gods, but he does not do so alone. The process involves the wombs of birth goddesses who shape the new beings after divine models. The resulting humans are not servants but intermediaries, half clay, half light. Over time, this divine inheritance diluted, but in the rulers, it remained concentrated. The kings, therefore, were not merely political figures, they were vessels of the old essence. Archaeologists have found burial sites in early Mesopotamia that hint at this belief. The graves of elites contain not only wealth, but unusual remains, elongated skulls, traces of a deliberate cranial deformation, perhaps to mimic the divine ancestors. Similar practices appear in Egypt, in the Andes, and even in prehistoric Europe. The motif of the elongated head, associated with wisdom and godhood, recurs across cultures separated by oceans. What began as reverence may have been imitation, an attempt to preserve, or to appear to preserve, a bloodline that was fading from the world. The earliest Sumerian kings claimed descent from Alulim, the first ruler of Eridu, chosen by the gods. Their seals bear winged figures hovering above mortals, touching them lightly on the shoulder or forehead. To us, these images are mythic. To them, they were memory. Each king was a bridge, the last living thread connecting mankind to the age before the flood. Even in later times, when the gods were said to have departed, the concept of divine lineage persisted. The priesthood guarded genealogies as if they were relics. Royal marriages were arranged to preserve purity, not of race, but of essence. In Egypt, the pharaohs married sisters. In Mesopotamia, rulers took priestesses as wives to ensure the mingling of sacred and temporal blood. To rule was to embody the union between heaven and earth. Modern scholars often dismiss such beliefs as superstition.
But recent genetic studies sometimes revive the unease of ancient stories. In the highlands of Iran, in Anatolia, and along the ancient Fertile Crescent, researchers have discovered haplogroups that appear unusually old, isolated branches of human DNA that predate known migrations. Some show signs of unexplained complexity, as if introduced from an external population no longer traceable. Could these anomalies be echoes of ancient mingling, not with gods, but with a lineage lost to history? Even within Sumerian texts, there is quiet anxiety about the decline of that divine inheritance. Later kings rule for shorter and shorter spans. The long-lived rulers of the pre-flood age, those who reigned for tens of thousands of years, give way to fragile mortal dynasties. The divine spark dims. Each generation becomes less connected to the heavens. The king list itself may be an elegy, a record of diminishing divinity, of a world slowly losing memory of its own origin. Perhaps this is why the myths of blood and rebirth persist. From Gilgamesh's search for immortality to the medieval legends of the Holy Grail, humanity keeps seeking the lost essence. The notion of a sacred lineage, a remnant of godhood hidden among men, surfaces again and again. The Knights Templar, the Merovingian bloodline, the royal genealogies of Europe, all echo the same Sumerian dream, that within certain veins still flows the bright blood of the gods. But maybe the truth is less literal and more haunting. Perhaps divine blood is not physical, but informational, a transmission of knowledge encoded in culture, myth, and instinct. Perhaps what we inherited from the Anunnaki was not their biology, but their memory, an unconscious drive toward creation, measurement, and transcendence. The myth of the divine hybrid may simply reflect the uneasy duality within humanity, half earth, half sky.
We build machines to touch the stars, yet we bury ourselves in soil. We seek eternity, yet are haunted by decay. The ancients gave this contradiction a name, the mingling of God and man, because they needed a story to contain the impossible tension of what it means to be human. Still, one cannot ignore the strained parallels. Why did so many civilizations preserve genealogies with such precision? Why did royal insignia often feature wings, suns, or serpents? Symbols of transformation and ascension. The serpent in particular was sacred to Enki, representing wisdom coiled in the blood. It slithered across myth and medicine alike, winding through time until it became the modern symbol of healing, the double helix of life itself. Every story of divine descent ends the same way, with silence. The gods withdraw, the blood thins, humanity forgets. Yet in the quiet rhythm of our hearts, in the restless curiosity that drives us to uncover the past, perhaps something of that essence still stirs. If the Anunnaki truly mingled with humanity, their legacy is not in relics or monuments. It is in our impulse to remember them, and somewhere in our blood, perhaps, lies a single strand of memory still whispering, waiting to awaken when the stars align once more. When the old gods vanished, they did not die. They were renamed. In the long twilight that followed the flood, as new kingdoms rose from the silt of the rivers, the Anunnaki began to fade from the records. Their images were softened, their attributes divided, their names replaced by gentler ones. The storm god Enlil became a distant skyfather. Enki, the wise and rebellious one, was recast as a mere trickster. In Babylon, Marduk claimed their thrones. In Canaan, El and Yahweh inherited their dominion. The gods did not disappear. They were absorbed. The world forgot their faces, but their patterns endured. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly through centuries of rewriting and reinterpretation. The clay tablets of Sumer turned to dust. New scribes copied their stories in Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian tongues. Each translation bent the truth a little more, until myth became theology, and theology became law. The ancient kings, once described as servants of the Anunnaki, began to call themselves chosen by a single god, not descended from heaven, but blessed by it. Kingship shifted from divine inheritance to divine approval. In that subtle change, the memory of the Anunnaki was erased. The fall of Sumer itself was not a single event, but a slow unraveling. Droughts struck, rivers shifted, and invasions came from the north. The temples of Eridu, Ur, and Nippur filled with dust. Yet in their ruins, archaeologists have found strange layers, deposits of ashen silt that suggest fires followed by deliberate burial. Some believe these reeked of desecration, others of preservation. When a god's temple was abandoned, it was customary to seal it, to entomb the divine presence so it would not wander. In those sealed chambers, under the weight of sand and time, the memory of the Anunnaki was trapped. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written long after Sumer's fall, the hero seeks the secret of eternal life from Utnapishtim, the last survivor of the flood. But even in that latest story, echoes of the older world remain. Gilgamesh's journey takes him through the gates of the mountain where the scorpion men guard the path of the sun, ancient symbols of the old gods' watchers. When he reaches Utnapishtim, the immortal man tells him that the gods decreed death for mankind, keeping immortality for themselves. It is a bitter reversal of the earlier Sumerian belief that humans once shared divine blood. The myth itself remembers the erasure, the wall that was built between gods and men. By the time the Babylonians rose to power, the Anunnaki had been reclassified. They were no longer the creators or rulers of the world, but judges of the underworld, beings confined to the shadows, stripped of their celestial grandeur. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk slays the primeval goddess Tiamat, fashions the heavens from her body, and appoints the gods of old to lower stations. The myth reads like a coup, a celestial revolution in narrative form. Power changed hands, and in the process the old order was rewritten as chaos. This rewriting was not merely theological, it was political. Each empire that conquered Mesopotamia reshaped its gods to legitimize its rule. To erase an old god was to erase an old king, to enthrone a new god was to claim eternity for a new dynasty. The priests of Babylon were not historians, they were editors of reality, and the first thing they edited was memory. Some fragments survive their censorship. In a tablet found near Larsa, an older text laments, "The gods have gone, the temples are empty, these songs are sung to no one." The line trembles with loss, as though the writer still felt their absence. It is the voice of a civilization realizing that the divine world it once knew had gone silent. In that silence, monotheism was born. When the Hebrews came into contact with Mesopotamian culture during their exile in Babylon, they encountered the old stories of the flood, of the garden, of creation from clay, and reshaped them into a new framework. The Anunnaki vanished from the page, but their essence lingered in the language of Genesis. Let us make man in our image, the text says, though the us is never explained. The plural remains like a fossil in theology. The same pattern can be traced in Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The pantheons grow smaller, the gods more abstract. By the time of the Greeks, the divine had descended fully into metaphor. The Titans, vast primordial beings, were defeated by Olympians, much as the Anunnaki were overthrown by the younger gods. History, it seems, repeats itself even in myth. But beneath these layers of reinterpretation, a strange continuity endures. The symbols of the Anunnaki, the winged disk, the rod and ring, the tree of life, appear again and again in later art, disguised under new meanings. The winged sun becomes the Egyptian Aten, then the Christian halo. The tree of life becomes the Kabbalistic diagram of creation. The rod and ring, once symbols of cosmic order, evolve into the scepter and crown of earthly monarchs. The gods may have been forgotten, but their emblems still rule. Even the idea of divine rebellion, angels cast out of heaven for giving knowledge to mankind, mirrors Enki's defiance in Sumerian myth. The serpent in Eden is no different from the serpent of Eridu, the symbol of wisdom and forbidden truth. The story was inverted. The bringer of knowledge became the tempter. The savior became the deceiver. What had once been gratitude became guilt. By the time the last cuneiform tablet was written, around the 1st century CE, the old language itself was dying. The clay was dry, the stylus broken. In one final record, a scribe writes, "The gods no longer answer." It is a line of surrender, but also of quiet understanding. The silence of the Anunnaki was not abandonment, it was transformation. The divine had withdrawn into myth, waiting for those who could still read between the lines. Today, as archaeologists unearth those tablets, brushing away dust that has lain untouched for 4,000 years, the same question lingers. What truly ended in Sumer? A civilization, a language, or a covenant? Perhaps the gods never left at all. Perhaps they changed their names, adapted their masks, and survived in the very faiths that replaced them. The Anunnaki may no longer rule from ziggurats or temples, but their echoes shape every thought of origin and divinity we possess. Their symbols decorate churches, palaces, and flags. Their stories pulse through scripture and philosophy alike. If gods can die, then so can truth. But if gods only change their form, then perhaps they are still here. Not in heaven, but in the stories that refuse to fade. And when we whisper their forgotten names, Enki, Enlil, Inanna, perhaps we're not resurrecting the past. Perhaps we're only reminding the present that it too will one day become myth. There comes a point in every civilization when knowledge becomes too heavy to bear, when what was once sacred begins to threaten the order built around it. In Mesopotamia, this moment arrived quietly, not with a cataclysm, but with silence. As power shifted from the old temples of Eridu and Ur to newer, more centralized priesthoods, the keepers of wisdom began to guard it with secrecy. The gods no longer spoke in open skies or rivers. Their voices were confined to chambers and chants. The covenant of silence had begun. The phrase does not appear in any surviving tablet, but its traces everywhere. In the sudden disappearance of certain star maps, in the sealed libraries of kings, in the strange uniformity of later myths. Knowledge, once given freely, was being hidden. The priesthoods who once served the gods became custodians of their memory, gatekeepers of divine power. The age of the Anunnaki gave way to the age of intermediaries. The Sumerians had believed that wisdom flowed from Enki's subterranean Abzu, rising like fresh water through channels to feed the world. But by the time of Babylon, the Abzu was locked away. Access to the sacred texts was restricted to those initiated in the temple schools. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, once the language of the gods, became the tools of control. The priests spoke in riddles, preserving meaning through ritual but withholding understanding. Knowledge itself had become a form of dominion. Somewhere in this transformation lies the origin of hierarchy as we know it. The king ruled by divine decree, but only the priests could interpret that decree. The masses were left with faith, while truth was sealed in tablets and vaults. Perhaps this is how all civilizations survive, by forgetting just enough of what they know to remain obedient to the rest. In the Enuma Elish, the creation myth that replaced older Sumerian stories, Marduk slays the chaos dragon Tiamat and divides the heavens. He establishes order, hierarchy, and silence. The other gods bow to him and proclaim, "His word shall be law." It is a myth of victory but also of censorship. Where once the cosmos was a conversation, Enki's laughter in the water, Inanna's song in the wind, now it became decree. The divine voice was singular, absolute. Dissent was unthinkable. From that moment onward, the notion of divine plurality faded. Polytheism collapsed into monotheism. Dialogue became dogma. But the price of unity was amnesia. The older gods, those who had given fire and knowledge to humankind, were recast as demons or tempters. The serpent of wisdom became the serpent of deceit. The lightbringer became the adversary. The story had been rewritten, but the shape of its shadow remained the same. Historians trace this evolution as natural, the consolidation of power in growing states, the streamlining of belief to unify populations. Yet beneath that pragmatic explanation lies something more haunting: the deliberate erasure of cosmic memory. Every myth that warns against forbidden knowledge, from Eden to Prometheus to the Tower of Babel, repeats the same pattern. Knowledge once shared between gods and men becomes forbidden, its pursuit punished by exile or fire. The covenant of silence was not only between priest and god, it was between the divine and the human mind. In the ruins of Nineveh, the great library of Ashurbanipal once contained over 30,000 clay tablets. Astronomy, medicine, mathematics, law, all meticulously copied. The king himself boasted, "I have read the writings of the days before the flood." What writings were these? None survive in full. After his death, the library burned. The clay tablets were baked by the flames, preserving only fragments. It is as if history itself conspired to half reveal, half conceal what it once knew. In the centuries that followed, fragments of that knowledge reappeared in secret schools: the Chaldean astrologers, the Hermeticists, the Gnostics. Each claimed to possess remnants of the old science, fragments of the Anunnaki's wisdom. But to preserve it, they too had to hide it. The covenant of silence had become tradition. In its shadow grew the idea that some truths were not meant for all. It is strange how secrecy can outlast memory. Even now, we inherit the reflex to guard what we learn. Power and knowledge remain inseparable, just as they were in Sumer. The more a truth can reshape the world, the deeper it is buried beneath symbols and myth. And so, while modern scholars analyze the tablets for data, counting grains, decoding trade lists, they overlook the silence between the words, the deliberate omissions, the blank spaces where something sacred once lived. The Egyptians called such silence Heka, the power to shape reality through hidden speech. To speak a name was to bind it. To withhold it was to preserve its power. Perhaps this is what the Anunnaki understood too late: that knowledge once released cannot be unlearned. So their priests did the only thing they could: they sealed it. They replaced speech with symbol, replaced revelation with ritual. The gods would speak again, but only through whispers. There are stories, half myth, half memory, of hidden vaults beneath the ancient ziggurats, where stone boxes sealed in bitumen hold tablets of unknown content. Excavations at Uruk and Ura uncovered rooms deliberately filled with clay and rubble before being abandoned, as if to conceal something within. The official reports call them storehouses, but what were they storing? Perhaps records from before the flood, too fragile or too dangerous to reveal. When the lost Babylonian temple fell to the armies of Cyrus, the scribes carried their tablets into exile. Some became slaves in foreign lands, others became teachers. Their language survived in fragments, traces of cuneiform reappearing in Greek magical texts, in hermetic formulas, in the symbols of alchemy. Even the word alchemy echoes Alkemet, a black land, Egypt, the lost refuge of Mesopotamian knowledge. It is tempting to imagine that the covenant of silence still endures, not as conspiracy, but as instinct. The impostor conceal, to protect the sacred from the profane, the powerful from the unprepared. Each age rewrites its myths, burying dangerous truths under gentler metaphors. The Anunnaki were forgotten, yet their warning remains, that knowledge without wisdom is a flood waiting to return. Perhaps that is why so many of their temples were built with deep foundations and open roofs, to remind humanity that the earth and sky are mirrors, and that truth lives between them, not in either alone. If the covenant of silence began as a protection, it ended as a prison. The divine voice grew faint, hidden beneath centuries of ritual and fear. And yet, when the wind moves over the old stones of Eridu, when the sand trembles above the buried Abzu, some swear they still hear it. The low murmur of water beneath the earth, whispering the same forbidden question. How much knowledge can a world bear before it must forget again? Across the world, the ruins of antiquity rise like fossils of a vanished thought. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, stepped temples in Mesoamerica, stone circles scattered through Europe. Separated by oceans and epochs, they share the same strange geometry. Axial alignments with the sun and stars, proportions derived from sacred ratios, foundations echoing a pattern too precise to be coincidence. The hidden architecture of power did not belong to one culture. It was a blueprint passed through time, perhaps from the same forgotten source that once whispered to the first kings of Eridu. At its heart lies a simple mystery. Why did so many ancient structures serve no clear utilitarian purpose? Why build mountains of stone that cannot be lived in, farmed, or defended? The answer, perhaps, is that they were never meant for the living. They were meant for the gods. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was not a monument, but a bridge. Its stairways connected the human world with the realm of the divine. The top platform was called the bond between heaven and earth. In Egypt, the pyramid was the same symbol, turned inward, a stairway for the soul, a frozen ray of sunlight to guide the pharaoh back to the stars. When viewed from above, these structures reveal harmonies invisible from the ground. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns almost perfectly to true north, an accuracy unmatched until the invention of the telescope. The ziggurat of Ur mirrors the same alignment, though separated by 1,000 miles and 1,000 years. The stones of Stonehenge track solstices with astronomical precision, while the temples of Teotihuacan encode the ratios of planetary orbits. How could cultures supposedly isolated and primitive achieve such cosmic synchronization? Unless, perhaps, they were remembering the same lost knowledge. Geometry is a sacred inheritance. The word geometry itself comes from geometron, the measure of the earth. But to the ancients, it also meant the measure of heaven. Every temple was a diagram of the cosmos. Its walls replicated the structure of creation, a base for the underworld, a middle realm for life, a summit for the divine. The dimensions of each level corresponded to planetary distances, musical intervals, or the proportions of the human body. The builders were not only architects, they were initiates, translating metaphysical order into stone. In Sumerian legend, the decrees of the gods, included architecture itself. To build was to imitate divine creation. Each structure was a contract, a renewal of the covenant between humans and the celestial order. The Anunnaki, it was said, had shown the first builders how to mirror the heavens on earth. This was the foundation of kingship. To rule was to construct, to shape chaos into form. Even after the gods withdrew, the kings continued building, perhaps because they believed that by replicating the sacred pattern, they could draw the gods back. Modern archaeology explains these similarities through diffusional coincidence, trade routes, migration, independent discovery. But the deeper one looks, the harder coincidence becomes. The same mathematical constants, pi, the golden ratio, the precessional number 72, recur across civilizations with no known contact. Ancient builders in both hemispheres encoded the same astronomical cycles, even those invisible without advanced instruments. At what point does shared intuition become evidence of shared origin? In the ruins of Babylon, fragments of stone tablets describe the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Scholars identify it with Etim and Enki, the temple that inspired the biblical Tower of Babel. Its original purpose, they say, was astronomical, a high place for observing the stars. But later myths transform it into a symbol of hubris, of humans trying to reach the gods. The story ends with fragmentation of language, of unity, of memory. It is almost as if the act of building itself had become forbidden. The tower was not destroyed for touching the sky, but for remembering how. In Egypt, the priests of Heliopolis guarded a similar memory. They told that the first temple had been designed in imitation of the Benben, a radiant mound that rose from the primordial waters. It was both a place and an idea, the first solid point in a sea of chaos. Every pyramid, every obelisk was a reflection of that cosmic hill. The same symbol appears in Sumer as the mound of Eridu, the sacred hill upon which kingship first descended. Even in distant Mesoamerica, the pyramids of the sun and moon rise above a buried river, their bases carved to represent the mountain of creation. The architecture repeats, echoing an archetype as old as memory itself. It is as though each civilization inherited the same map, a plan drawn not on paper, but in the collective dream of humanity. When the flood came, that dream was scattered, surviving only in fragments, angles, proportions, rituals. The survivors built again, following the patterns they barely remembered, encoding their gratitude and fear in stone. The result was a global architecture of remembrance. But what if these monuments served another purpose? Some researchers suggest that the shapes themselves, the pyramids, the circles, the terraces, act as resonant devices, amplifying natural frequencies of the earth. The ziggurats, with their alternating layers of clay and bitumen, resemble crude capacitors. The pyramid's chambers correspond to harmonic nodes. To ancient priests, sound and vibration were sacred tools. In the Sumerian temples, hymns were chanted at specific frequencies believed to open the gate between worlds. Perhaps these were not metaphors. Perhaps the buildings themselves were instruments, designed to tune the human spirit to the vibration of the divine. The notion seems mystical, yet modern physics quietly affirms it. Everything vibrates. Frequency shapes matter. Cymatics, the study of sound patterns on surfaces, reveals that specific tones generate precise geometric forms. Could the ancients have known this, intuitively or otherwise? The same spirals and wave patterns found in smatic experiments appear carved into stone from Malta to Bolivia. The language of form is universal because it is the language of vibration. The Anunnaki, if they existed, may not have been gods in the sense we imagine. They may have been architects of consciousness, engineers who understood the resonance between heaven and earth. The temples were not places of worship, but conduits, transmitters linking human awareness with cosmic order. The later priesthoods inheriting these sacred sites remembered the rituals but forgot the reasons. The knowledge became religion, the science became faith, and yet, when one stands before those ruins, the silence is not empty. It hums faintly, like breath caught between worlds. The stones seem to remember. The wind moves through their corridors as if tracing an invisible rhythm. Even now, millennia after their builders vanished, the structures still perform that ancient task, aligning earth with sky, matter with memory. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the hidden architecture. Not technology, but intention. The understanding that creation itself is a sacred act, that to build is to remember the order of the cosmos. Each temple, each pyramid, each circle of stone is a fragment of that memory, a reminder that the divine once walked here and left blueprints behind. And if one day we rediscover the purpose of those designs, if the harmony between heaven and earth were ever restored, would the gods return to their temples? Or would we finally realize that they never left, that they were the architecture itself, waiting patiently for us to listen again? Deep beneath the shifting sands of southern Iraq, where the ruins of Eridu crumble in silence, there are whispers of a tomb that was never meant to be found. The ancient texts speak of it obliquely, a chamber of the one who crossed the waters, sealed after the flood, unreachable by mortal hands. Some call it the resting place of Alulim, the first king to descend from heaven. Others believe it belongs to Zeus Sudra, the flood survivor, whom later traditions would remember as Noah. Yet among those who study the forbidden tablets, a different name circulates, one never spoken aloud in the temples of old, the last Anunnaki king. Archaeologists have long searched the site for answers. Eridu, once a port on the edge of the Persian Gulf, now lies miles inland, entombed in desert. Beneath its ziggurat they discovered 17 layers of construction, each older than the one above, stretching back into the Neolithic twilight. The lowest layer, they say, rests upon an anomaly, a chamber of fired brick unlike any structure known from that time. Its entrance has never been opened. The walls of its passage aligned with a bitumen that resists every modern drill, as though designed to defy intrusion. The official reports call it an unfinished foundation, but others suspect it was finished long before the first city rose. According to Sumerian myth, after the flood, the gods withdrew from the world, leaving only one among them to watch over mankind, a ruler who would preserve their laws until the heavens reopened. This being, half divine and half flesh, was said to have walked the earth for thousands of years, unseen but never gone. Some texts refer to him as the shepherd beneath the waters, others as he of the hidden throne. He did not die, the stories say, but entered the Abzu, the subterranean realm of Enki, to sleep until the time of renewal. The last of the Anunnaki kings became the first guardian of silence. To modern ears, this sounds like myth, but every legend begins with an echo of fact. The archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated Ur in the 1920s, wrote of discovering a deep flood layer, a band of sterile clay separating two civilizations. Above it lay the Sumerians. Below, something else, older and unclassified. In that lower stratum he found shards of pottery fired at impossible temperatures and tools of copper alloy far more advanced than their supposed age. Woolley believed he'd found the physical evidence of the Great Flood. He did not realize he might also have been standing atop the boundary of two worlds. In the years that followed, rumors spread among his workers of tunnels leading beneath the temples, passages sealed with black pitch. Some claimed they heard water running deep underground, though the site lay in arid desert. Others spoke of a faint vibration in the walls like the beating of a slow heart. When they reported this to their superiors, they were told it was wind, but no wind moves beneath the earth. Later Sumerian tablets describe a ritual called the Descent of Kingship, performed once every 1,000 years. A priest would enter a chamber beneath the temple, carrying a golden rod and a tablet of lapis lazuli. He would read from the ancient hymns, then vanish for 3 days. When he returned, he was said to bear the voice of the sleeping king. Perhaps this was symbolic, a dramatization of communion with the gods. Or perhaps the ritual was literal, an echo of contact with something still present in the depths. The Abzu in myth was more than water. It was a living archive, the ocean of memory beneath the world. Enki ruled there, surrounded by the Anuna who had not ascended. The texts describe it as a place of shimmering light and eternal sound, where words were things and thought became form. To the priests of Eridu, entering the Abzu was not descent but return, a passage back to the realm of origins. If a king were buried there, his tomb would not be a grave, but a gate. The lost Anunnaki king, whoever he was, appears nowhere in later genealogies. After the flood, his name is omitted. The king list resumes with mortal rulers, their reigns suddenly shortened, their power earthly. It is as if a line was deliberately severed, a clean cut between the divine and the human. Yet fragments of hymns found at Nippur hint that the divine bloodline did not end. It merely went underground. He sleeps in the deep place, inscription reads, until the stars turn and the measure of heaven is renewed. Such language is easy to romanticize, but the archaeological evidence is hardest to dismiss. Ground-penetrating surveys of Eridu have revealed a network of subsurface cavities, geometric, symmetrical, unlike any natural formation. One chamber, directly beneath the ziggurat's central platform, measures nearly 40 meters long. No entrance has ever been found. Local legends warn against digging too deep. Shepherds claim their flocks avoid the area, as if sensing something beneath. In 2018, a private research team attempted to bore through the ancient bitumen. Their equipment failed. Instruments overheated, and a static charge built up in the surrounding soil. The project was quietly abandoned. Skeptics see coincidence, superstition, or perhaps a trick of geology. Yet even they admit that the persistence of the legend is unusual. Civilizations forget easily, yet Eridu's story refuses to die. Every few decades, someone returns, an archaeologist, a mystic, a wanderer, drawn by the same question: what sleeps beneath? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero seeks a plant that grants eternal life, found only at the bottom of the sea. He retrieves it, but a serpent steals it away. The myth may hide a deeper truth, that immortality, or something like it, lies buried beneath the waters, guarded by silence. The lost Anunnaki king may not have been immortal in body, but immortal in knowledge. The lost living vessel of pre-flood wisdom, sealed in darkness so that it might one day rise again. The ancients did not build tombs as memorials, they built them as vaults. The pyramid, the ziggurat, the mound, each was a keyhole between worlds. Inside, the body of a king was not a corpse but a seed, buried in imitation of the sun that dies each night and returns each dawn. If the lost Anunnaki king lies beneath Eridu, he is not buried, he is waiting, and perhaps that is why the site remains untouched. Perhaps the silence is deliberate. A flood may have cleansed the earth, but the flood of time cannot wash away the fear that opening such a tomb would be the same as opening the gate between eras. The desert has a way of preserving secrets. It does not decay them. It desiccates them, freezes them in eternity. Somewhere in that parched stillness lies the oldest secret of all, the point where myth and matter touch. Beneath the ruins of the first city sleeps the last king of the gods, a being neither man nor immortal, whose legacy is the silence that followed his departure. If that tomb were ever opened, if the Abzu were disturbed and the waters below began to rise once more, what would emerge? A relic of history, or a reminder that history itself is not finished? And when the sand finally gives way, will we discover that the gods we buried have been dreaming of us all along? Time in the ancient world did not flow like a river, it turned like a wheel. Every beginning was also a return, and every ending a rehearsal for rebirth. But somewhere between the flood and the founding of the first empires, that wheel fractured. The old cycles were broken, and the record of the past began to collapse into contradiction. In the centuries that followed, civilizations rose with astonishing speed, as if rebuilding from blueprints already known. Yet when scholars tried to trace the sequence of these events, they found the timeline itself had been tampered with. The deeper they dug, the more the dates unraveled. What emerged was not a history but a distortion, the echo of a world rewritten. Chronologists call it the problem of ancient synchronization. The farther back we look, the less the clocks agree. The Egyptian dynasties, the Mesopotamian kings, the Indus Valley rulers, their calendars overlap in ways that should be impossible. The flood of Sumer occurs in the same epoch as the reign of Egypt's first pharaohs, and yet both claim to be the beginning of civilization. The Mayan long count starts at a point eerily close to the Sumerian creation date. Even the precession of the stars seems to have been recalibrated, as if some unseen hand had reset the cosmic dial. To explain these contradictions, historians devised corrections, missing centuries, scribal errors, dynasties invented or duplicated. But the anomalies persist. There are entire centuries that vanish without a trace, and others that appear twice under different names. Between the fall of Sumer and the rise of Akkad, between the Middle and New Kingdoms of Egypt, there lie gaps so wide that even archaeology cannot fill them. Could they be remnants of lost epochs, deliberately erased or folded into others? Or do they represent something stranger, a compression of time itself, as if the rhythm of history had been artificially condensed? In 1999, a Russian mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko proposed the radical idea that ancient chronologies had been systematically rewritten during the early medieval period. His theories are controversial, often dismissed as pseudoscience, yet his central observation remains unsettling. Our historical record is built upon overlapping copies of the same archetype, each retold under a new guise. The story of one empire becomes the story of another. Kings repeat, names recur, events mirror each other in perfect symmetry. Whether by accident or design, history behaves like a simulation reloaded. But this rewriting may not have begun in medieval Europe. The first manipulation of time could have occurred much earlier, at the moment when the gods withdrew and kingship passed entirely to men. The transition from mythic to historical time was not gradual, it was imposed. In the Sumerian king list, the reigns of the pre-flood kings stretch across tens of thousands of years. After the flood, they shrink abruptly to hundreds, then decades. The compression is mathematical, precise, as though someone recalibrated the scale of human existence. Perhaps it was a way to normalize memory, to turn the impossible into the believable, to make divine history fit the measure of human years. The Babylonians inherited this revised timeline and standardized it further, embedding cosmic cycles into their calendars. They divided the sky into 12 houses, the day into 12 hours of light and 12 of darkness, each mirroring the 12 great gods. Time itself became an act of worship, but also a prison. The wheel of eternity was now divided into cages of arithmetic. Still, anomalies leak through. Certain Sumerian texts mention a lost cycle, a great span of years omitted from official reckoning. The term they used, Kir-Nigin, translates loosely as the erased foundation. Archaeologists have debated its meaning for decades. Was it metaphorical? The destruction of a city, perhaps? Or literal? A deliberate removal of time from record? Some researchers suggest that cataclysmic periods, like the Younger Dryas or the Late Bronze Age collapse, were later condensed into symbolic reigns to simplify cosmic chronology. But others whisper that the erasure was purposeful, that memory itself was edited to conceal the truth of what came before. The more one studies the ancient calendars, the more they seem to behave like overlapping frequencies, resonating, interfering, producing beats and echoes. The Mayan Baktuns, the Vedic Yugas, the Sumerian Sa cycles. Each describe an immense pattern of rise and fall, of creation and destruction, lasting thousands of years. When aligned, these cycles converge around certain dates, roughly 10,800 BCE, 3100 BCE, and our own era. Each marks a turning of the cosmic wheel, a moment of transition between ages. The flood, the dawn of writing, the modern age, all correspond to these junctures. Are they coincidences, or recurring resets encoded into the very fabric of time? Even our modern chronology may not be immune. There are hints that the ancient systems were designed to synchronize with celestial events. The precession of equinoxes, solar cycles, even periodic cosmic encounters. If the ancients tracked such rhythms, then their calendars were not human inventions at all, but instruments tuned to the heartbeat of the cosmos. When those instruments were broken, the melody of history itself faltered. In the temple ruins of Sippar, a cuneiform tablet known as the Chronicle of Early Kings recounts a chilling detail. After the flood, the tablets of destinies were hidden, and time was reset by decree of the great gods. The line has been interpreted metaphorically, but perhaps it was literal. Perhaps an event, geological or astronomical, so disrupted the world that even the flow of time seemed to start anew. Survivors struggling to rebuild may have measured their age from that rebirth, erasing what came before. In doing so, they preserved order, but lost memory. Some modern physicists studying the relationship between gravity and time suggest that cataclysmic events could distort temporal flow on a planetary scale. If Earth was struck by an object large enough to shift its rotation or tilt, the length of the day itself could change. The stars would realign, calendars would fail. Imagine a civilization waking up beneath a different sky, the years shortened, the history erased. The myths of sudden darkness, of the sun standing still or reversing its course, might be echoes of that cosmic trauma. If the ancients experienced such a disruption, their attempt to reconstruct time would have been an act of survival. To control history was to control reality. The priesthoods who held the power to count, to measure, to record, held the key to existence itself. Their chronologies were not history books. They were mechanisms, recalibrations of the cosmic clock to keep the illusion of continuity intact. But something in that reconstruction broke. The past became fragmented, layered like the ruins beneath Eridu. Each new epoch built upon the rubble of another, each claiming to be the beginning. What we call ancient history may only be one surviving version of many, a palimpsest of civilizations that have risen and fallen countless times. And so, when we read the tablets, we are not reading a single story but an edited archive, a rewritten chronicle shaped by those who survived the last collapse. The missing centuries, the duplicated kings, the sudden leaps in progress. They are not mistakes, they are scars. Perhaps that is why the ancients spoke of the gods not as creators, but as renewers. Each age ends in flood, fire, or forgetting, and each time a few fragments of memory remain, enough to start again. The wheel turns, the records reset, and history begins anew, pretending it has never happened before. But the stones remember, the alignments remain. And somewhere in the rhythm of the stars, the true chronology of the world still waits. Silent, perfect, eternal. When the wheel turns once more, will we recognize the pattern repeating? Or will we, like the ancients, mistake the beginning of the next age for the end of time? There are moments in myth when history seems to pause, holding its breath between one age and the next. The ancient Sumerians called this interval Namtar, the turning of fate, the point when heaven and earth realign. The Egyptians spoke of it as the return of Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods once more walk among men. In Mesoamerica, the Maya called it the completion of a Baktun, a cycle in which worlds die and are reborn. Across cultures, the belief is the same, that creation moves not forward, but in circles. The gods depart only to return when the stars repeat their pattern. And at the center of this great rotation lies the shadow of prophecy, the return cycle. According to the old texts, the Anunnaki were not eternal beings. They had lifespans that dwarfed our own but were still bound to celestial rhythm. Their home was said to orbit beyond the known heavens, returning to the inner worlds only after vast ages. The Sumerians named this path Nibiru, the planet of crossing, the star that marks renewal. Modern interpreters have twisted it into fantasy, yet the image remains compelling, a hidden cycle of return, written not just in myth, but perhaps in the mechanics of the cosmos itself. Every few thousand years, the Earth experiences a cascade of changes, climate shifts, magnetic reversals, sudden extinctions. These events repeat with uncanny regularity, as though triggered by an unseen clock. The last great upheaval, around 12,800 years ago, marked the end of the Ice Age and the destruction of the pre-flood world. Could it have coincided with the last crossing of Nibiru, a gravitational or celestial event now lost to memory? The ancients may have encoded such knowledge not as prediction, but as remembrance. The return of the gods may simply describe the recurrence of cosmic catastrophe. In the Enuma Elish, the gods swear an oath after the flood, promising to restore order when the circuits of heaven complete their turn. Enki, the wise one, is said to sleep within the Absu until that moment, guarding the secrets of the deep. If taken literally, it suggests a waiting, an interval between interventions, not the end of divine presence, but its withdrawal until the appointed time. The cycle of presence and absence, rise and fall, mirrors the cosmic oscillations the ancients observed in the sky. Even outside Mesopotamia, echoes of this belief persist. The Egyptians believed that after a long darkness, the god Osiris would rise again as Horus, leading humanity into a new dawn. The Hindus spoke of Kalki, the final avatar who will appear at the end of Kali Yuga to restore the lost Dharma. Amaya awaited the return of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who would descend when Venus completed its cycle. Each myth names a savior, but the pattern is mechanical, cosmic, a synchronization between celestial recurrence and human awakening. Perhaps what the ancients understood, and what we've forgotten, is that civilization itself is bound to these rhythms. Each age begins with revelation and ends with entropy. Knowledge expands until it outgrows wisdom. Power accumulates until it consumes its source. Then comes collapse, followed by renewal. The gods return not to punish, but to reset the balance. Their arrival is not descent from heaven, but the re-emergence of forces older than civilization. There are hints that the Sumerians tracked this pattern through celestial cycles of immense scale. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, completes one turn every 25,120 years. Divide it by 2 and we have the half cycle between cataclysms, roughly 12,060 years. The last major cataclysm, the Younger Dryas, occurred almost exactly that long ago. Coincidence, perhaps, or a signal that the wheel is nearing its next rotation. Inscriptions from late Babylonian astronomy speak of the star of kingship that reappears every 12,000 years, heralding both disaster and renewal. It is said to shine red, trailing fire. Skeptics see in this only mythic embellishment, perhaps inspired by comets. Yet the ancient obsession with cyclical destruction suggests something more deliberate: observation. The ancients may have recorded the periodic return of a celestial visitor, a body whose passage brings gravitational chaos, meteor storms, and the resetting of ages. In the Epic of Atarna, one of the oldest known stories, a mortal king is carried to heaven by an eagle in search of the plant of birth. As they ascend, Atarna sees the earth shrinking below him until it looks like a bowl cast in the sea. The tale is strange, almost modern, a vision of earth from above. But its ending is cryptic. Atarna falls, the eagle vanishes, and time begins again. Some scholars interpret it as a metaphor for failed ascent, others as a cyclical allegory. What rises must fall. What falls will rise again. Throughout the Near East, prophecies of return lingered long after the temples fell. The Chaldeans believed that a celestial alignment would one day reopen the gates of the gods. The Hebrews transformed that expectation into messianic hope, a promise that the divine would one day return in human form. The Greeks reimagined it as the Great Year, a cosmic revolution when all planets align and history resets. The theme never vanishes, it only changes costume. Even today, beneath scientific vocabulary, it whispers the same old refrain, that something vast and ancient is approaching. Perhaps this cycle is not external at all. Perhaps the gods return through us. Each time humanity reaches a threshold of knowledge, splitting the atom, mapping the genome, awakening artificial minds, we repeat the drama of the first time. We become the new Anunnaki, wielding creation and destruction alike. Maybe that is what the myths were warning, that the gods never left because they were always within us, dormant in memory, waiting for the pattern to repeat. The return cycle, then, may not be an event, but an awakening. The moment when collective consciousness reactivates forgotten knowledge. The same instinct that built ziggurats and pyramids drives us to build towers of glass and satellites of metal. The architecture is changed, but the impulse is identical. We reach upward, searching the stars for something that once descended. And perhaps, when we find it, we will realize it was only a reflection. Still, the ancients left warnings. They spoke of floods that cleanse, fires that purify, and silence that follows arrogance. Every return begins with ruin, because only through destruction can order be reborn. The wheel turns, and those who cling to the past are swept away with it. The wise do not resist the cycle, they prepare for it. They remember that the end is never the end, but the resetting of the measure of heaven. And if the prophecies are right, if the long orbit of the gods is indeed closing once more, then perhaps we stand again on the threshold of renewal. The air grows warmer, the poles tremble, the sky flickers with unfamiliar light. We tell ourselves it is coincidence, climate, chance. But somewhere beneath reason, an older knowing stirs. The stars are realigning, the wheel is turning, the silence between worlds is thinning. And whether the next return brings gods or memory, it will remind us of the oldest truth of all, that nothing new ever begins. It only comes back around. In every civilization that has ever risen, there comes a moment when the voices of the past begin to echo through the present, softly at first, like a vibration beneath the skin of time. The myths that were once bedtime stories begin to align with discoveries in the ground. Old prophecies start to sound less like metaphor and more like archaeology. And through it all, one truth begins to shimmer from beneath the rubble. Memory does not die, it only changes form. This, perhaps, is the final legacy of the Anunnaki, the memory that refuses to die. For thousands of years, their names lay buried in forgotten languages. The temples of Eridu crumbled, their inscriptions sealed in bitumen, their gods reduced to whispers. Yet somehow, across 3 continents and 50 centuries, those whispers found their way back into human consciousness. The flood story, the descent of kingship, the gifts of knowledge and fire, all reborn under new names. It is as if humanity, no matter how many times it forgets, cannot help but remember the shape of its beginning. In the deserts of Iraq, the same wind that once carried the scent of temple incense now moves through excavation trenches, stirring dust around the broken clay tablets. Each one bears the wedge marks of a hand that lived and vanished before the dawn of recorded history. Those marks are not just writing, they are fingerprints pressed into eternity. Every tablet uncovered, every fragment translated, draws us a little closer to something we've always known but cannot quite articulate. That we are not the first to seek understanding, nor the first to lose it. Even now, traces of the Anunnaki linger in the fabric of human thought. Their myths evolved into pantheons, their symbols into alphabets, their mathematics into the measure of our days. The base 60 system devised in Sumer still governs the ticking of every clock. The architectural ratios they taught still shape our cities. We may not bow to their idols, but we live within their design. The persistence of their memory is uncanny, almost biological. Across ages their images recur, winged figures with tablets in hand, serpents coiled around trees, stars enclosed in circles. These are not coincidences. They are the grammar of a forgotten language still whispering through our collective unconscious. Psychologists call them archetypes. Yet even Carl Jung admitted their source was older than time. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps these symbols are the genetic residue of an encounter too profound to erase. And so, the Anunnaki endure, not in flesh, but in the patterns of our remembering. Every myth that warns of a great flood, every vision of descent and return, carries a fragment of their story. The Egyptians turned them into the Neteru, the Greeks into titans, the Hebrews into watchers. Each culture reshaped the same eternal drama, beings of a light descending to teach, to rule, to fall, and to vanish into silence. Even the idea of angels, radiant winged intermediaries, may be a softened echo of them. The forms change, but the function remains, messengers between heaven and earth. Yet what if memory itself is not passive? What if it calls to us, steering our evolution toward rediscovery? Modern humanity is beginning to unearth knowledge once thought lost, from ancient DNA preserved in ice to energy patterns beneath megalithic sites. We are decoding genomes, manipulating atoms, reaching beyond the atmosphere. The same ambitions that once defined the gods now define us. And perhaps, in this mirroring, memory awakens, not to remind us of what we were, but to test what we are becoming. Some scholars speak of a cultural recursion, the tendency of civilizations to repeat symbolic forms unconsciously. But the recurrence feels more purposeful than random. The myth of the flood, for instance, has returned in our obsession with climate disaster. The myth of divine knowledge reappears in our pursuit of artificial intelligence, the creation of minds in our own image. The myth of Babel echoes in the global network of languages converging into code. Each is a retelling of the same cosmic story: creation, hubris, loss, renewal. It is as if we are rehearsing a play written long before history began. In that sense, the Anunnaki never needed to return. Their resurrection was inevitable. They exist wherever knowledge surpasses wisdom, wherever creation brushes against catastrophe. In every age of awakening, their spirit rises, the drive to reach higher, to remember more, to reclaim what was lost. Perhaps they are not our ancestors, but our reflection, the divine pattern emerging through human will each time the world begins again. The archaeologist's brush and the philosopher's question serve the same master, the hunger to remember. And yet there is unease in this remembering. Beneath every discovery lies the ghost of what it cost. The flood that washed away Sumer, the fire that buried Pompeii, the silence that swallowed Alexandria, all warnings carved into time. Knowledge always demands tribute. The Anunnaki understood that, which is why they buried theirs beneath water and myth. They knew that memory without reverence becomes weapon. Still, the past resists its own burial. The cuneiform tablets speak, the satellites scan, and the earth continues to give up her secrets. Fossilized tools, megalithic alignments, traces of lost maps drawn when Antarctica was ice-free. Each revelation feels less like discovery and more like recognition. We are not finding the unknown. We are remembering ourselves. Perhaps that is the truest meaning of the Anunnaki legacy. Not gods descending from the sky, but knowledge descending into consciousness. Again and again, through dream, intuition, and rediscovery. The descent of kingship might never have been a literal event, but a metaphor for the moment when awareness enters matter, when the eternal seeks expression in clay. Humanity is the vessel, and memory is the seed. Every civilization that rises carries that same seed within it, though few remember where it came from. And when the seed grows too wild, when it threatens to break the vessel, the cycle resets. Flood, fire, forgetting. Then, slowly, the memory returns, quieter, wiser, wearing a new face. Standing among the ruins of Eridu, one can feel this rhythm. The sand murmurs where walls once stood, and if you listen long enough, it begins to sound like breathing. The desert is not dead. It is waiting, as it always has, for memory to bloom again. One day, perhaps, we will uncover that final tablet, the one that bridges the mythic and the real, the divine and the human. And in reading it, we may realize that the lost Anunnaki king was never buried in stone but within us. The spark that refuses to be forgotten, the whisper that turns even silence into story. For memory, like the gods who gave it, does not die. It waits, it endures, and when the world grows quiet enough to listen, it speaks once more, beginning the story again, as if it never ended at all.